Started in a minute, just letting folks kind of join and get started, and we'll get started in about a minute. We're so glad that you could be with us. Thank you so much for joining for our See Yourself Running Rural Edition. We're going to get started in just a minute here. We're just letting everybody join the room and get the audio set up. So we'll get started in just a minute. If you'd like to take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat, now's a great time. Your name and where you are located and why you're joining the call tonight would be a great thing to share with everyone. Make sure you have your settings to all panelists and attendees. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to See Yourself Running, the realities of running in a rural community. My name is Andrea Johnson, and I'm a regional director for Run for Something, and I actually live in Leavenworth, Kansas. Tonight, I have the pleasure of being your host and moderator for this very important panel discussion. First, we'd like to start with a few housekeeping items. As I mentioned a second ago, please introduce yourself in the chat box. Make sure your settings are set to all panelists and attendees, and share your name, where you are, and what brought you to the call this evening. And then feel free to use the chat box throughout our session tonight to comment on the program or interact with other attendees. This is a great chance to get to know people and help build community. After some initial discussion with our panelists, we will also open up the floor for your questions. So if you have questions that you'd like to ask the panel, please put those questions in the Q&A box, not the chat box. Put questions for the panel in the Q&A box, and we'll pull the questions from there. It's hard to look at the chat box and pull questions while the session is going. So put any questions you have for the panel in the Q&A box. For this webinar, we're also using the Zoom live transcription services. So if you would like to view live captions on your screen, please click the More menu in the lower right-hand corner and select Show Subtitles. Later during the call, we also will be launching a poll. So if you'd like to take the next step in working with Runs for Something, you'll be able to opt in then. Okay, with all of the housekeeping covered, let's get into the program. The rural way of life is one that we know is worth fighting for. Rural communities have their own patterns and predilections, and running for office in a rural community has its own set of challenges. That is especially true when running as a progressive in many rural communities. But we live in these communities because we value this way of life and our bonds to the people in the land here. And we're here today because we know that one way to help our communities flourish is to run for something and lead our people towards a strong future. When we run for local office, we ensure our communities have all the tools they need to build a good life for themselves and their families, access to quality education, affordable health care, job training, infrastructure, and broadband, for example. And we know we can't rely on congressional leaders in Washington to solve all of our problems at home. We need to pick up the mantle of leadership here, where we know our communities and our problems and our solutions best. Before I jump in to introduce our panelists, I want to take a moment to review what Run for Something is all about. The top line is we encourage young, diverse progressives to run for local and state office. More specifically, Run for Something endorses diverse progressive candidates who are 40 and under, running for the first, second, or third time, and running for down ballot offices. So that's things like city council, mayor, county commission, state legislature, school board, county clerk, sheriff, or district attorney. Run for Something started in 2017, and in this time, we've identified more than 93,000 young people who want to run for office. We've endorsed over 1,800 all-star candidates in all 50 states. And to date, Run for Something has elected more than 630 candidates to state and local office in 48 states. Our winners are 50% 7% women, 58% people of color, and 21% LGBTQIA+. Our team provides coaching for our endorsed candidates to support you through every phase of your campaign. And we give you resources and trainings and connect candidates to partners who can help your campaigns as well. We also work with our alumni to support current candidates and to make connections that will help you govern successfully once elected. We do this because we know that more young, diverse, and exciting progressives running strong grassroots campaigns everywhere across the country will increase immediate turnout for Democrats up and down the ticket and will help build political power for underrepresented groups in all corners of our nation. And it will also change the conversation about who is electable in this country and where we can win. At Run for Something, we focus on local, county, and state offices because these elected leaders directly influence people's everyday lives, especially in rural communities. So we truly hope this call will either help you in your run or convince you to consider running for something in your community. Okay, with that said, let's introduce our panel of Run for Something elected leaders. First, we have Audrey Spanko, who was a Run for Something candidate in 2020 for the Texas Senate District 1. Next, we have Chloe Maxmin, a current member of the Maine State Senate for District 13 and a former Maine State Representative for District 88. And finally, we have Jen McMillin, a former candidate for Macon County Board and a 2018 candidate for Illinois State House District 101. So let's start the discussion with a quick question for each of you. Why did you decide to run for office? Audrey, do you want to go first?
Sure. Thank you for having us today. This is such a fun conversation. I'm so happy to see so many people on with us. But I ran for office for Texas State Senate in Northeast Texas, very, very rural, 10,000 square miles of 16 counties. Decided to run because I grew up in this rural area that just didn't have the resources. I am a licensed social worker and saw progressively through my career just a need and kept thinking, how do we address this need? How do we address this need? And I went from direct service to macro work and working more in policy and found myself at the Texas legislature watching bill after bill go through session that weren't helping the people that I had been desperately trying to help throughout my career, and thought the only way that I could ever really make the impact that I know is necessary for folks in East Texas and across the state of Texas is to run. So I got inspired and felt a need to do it, went to go see if anybody else was going to do it. And when no one else stepped up, I figured, okay, I guess it's me. So here we are, made a run for it and hopefully made a positive impact, and we'll see about running again in the future.
That is awesome, Audrey. Thank you. Chloe, how about you? Why did you decide to run for office?
That's such a good question, and I'm so glad to be here with all of you tonight. I ran for office for a variety of reasons, but I think the most succinct way is that in 2016, I really saw how the rural vote was not the only reason, but one of the major reasons that got Donald Trump elected, and also has led to this wave of Republican capture at the state and local level. The rural vote is very, very powerful right now. Yet for some reason, the Democrats have not really invested in rural areas. They've completely overlooked rural campaigning, and rural voices are left behind and righteously frustrated, and they're going the other way. So I grew up and live in one of these districts that voted for Trump and is consistently red and getting redder. And so I decided to run for office to see if there were ways to kind of to stem the tide. And so I flipped a district in 2018 and then flipped a district in 2020, just to really kind of experiment with different tools and tactics that we can use in rural communities to turn the rural vote back the right way. Because it's where our hearts are. It's just not where our voting is.
Yes, that's amazing. That's amazing. I love hearing these stories about what makes people run. Jen, you want to share with us why you decided to run for office?
I kind of feel like my story is a little flippant, looking back on it. So I live in the 13th congressional district in the state of Illinois. And I remember in 2014, 15, and 16, looking at my congressman, Mr. Rodney Davis, and realizing that I was smarter than Rodney Davis, and I listened better than Rodney Davis. So I got into politics. I really wanted to run for Congress, but I knew I wasn't ready. I had never been in politics, but we really had a need here in Central Illinois to have Democrats run. The district that I ended up running in for 2018 for the state rep race, we hadn't had a Democratic contender in that race in over 15 years. So we were able to gain votes in that district, which ended up helped the person that was running in the 13th. But yeah, I just looked around and saw, the guy that I ran against in my campaign, he's 78 this year. He's running again. And that's not the face of our community. He does not look like us anymore. And that's what I really want. I want more moms in office. I want more social workers in office. I want more doctors in office, because we're missing a whole swath of experiences. So I wanted to prove that I was smarter than Rodney Davis. I guess that's kind of a silly reason to run, though.
No, I think, what brings us to all of our places in this journey is important. And I think it's great to share with people your progress and how you evolved to these places. Okay, let's get into some more questions. Chloe, you proudly have run as a young person with a personal interest in addressing climate change in the oldest and most rural county in the oldest and most rural state in the US. And you've successfully won in 2020 against the highest ranking Republican in Maine. You are the youngest female Maine senator in the state's history, and you were the first Democrat ever elected to serve your state house district. What advice do you have for candidates who want to run in a district that may seem impossible?
Wow, when you put it all together like that. I was thinking about this earlier today, because I have a background in like more what I used to call radical organizing, like lots of civil disobedience and sit-ins, and my, like, that's where my heart was. And through my experiences campaigning in rural communities and talking with folks who have never been canvassed by a Democrat in their entire voting history, who are voting for Trump, I really come to think that maybe, while we need civil disobedience, no doubt, I think that the most radical thing that I've done in my life is listen to these stories and really understand this perspective. And that maybe the most radical thing that we can do right now is listen. Just like Jen was just saying, women usually listen better than men, but there are a lot of men who are great listeners as well. And so I think, when people ask me like how we win, my answer is always, we just listened. We heard these stories and these experiences that I would have never heard if I hadn't gone and knocked on doors, and that are just so profoundly excluded from progressive and democratic narratives in ways that aren't right. We're supposed to be inclusive, we're supposed to be accepting, and of course there are some narratives on the right that are really racist and xenophobic, and I don't have any space for that, and probably none of us do. But most of the stories are just stories of heartache and loss and dreams unfulfilled. And I think that's a universal story. But the rural context, which is why we're having this call, is so unique. And we're really paying the price for not listening. So that's that, I guess.
That's wonderful. I heard you loud and clear. Listening is centered, and I think that's absolutely true. Let's see. How about you, Audrey? At Run for Something, we emphasize supporting first-time candidates without political experience, because we know that running can be intimidating. But we also know that everyone needs to start somewhere. How did your professional experience as a social worker in hospitals and at the Department of Family and Protective Services help prepare you to run for office and to talk about issues relevant to your rural district?
Let's see. So I had zero political experience outside of knocking on a few doors and helping out a few candidates. I was not politically involved until it fell right in my face. And I was, as mentioned before, interning at the state capitol during the state legislative session, and realized there's a bunch of people making a bunch of decisions who don't have any superpowers or any special characteristics that make them in this office. Like, there's nothing about them that I can't do. And very much like Jen said, I knew I was smarter than a lot of the people who were in that building, and that I could make those decisions and I could advocate in a different way. So my experience specifically was able to say, I've seen these situations. I've worked with families in every realm, every stage of life, to be able to help them get what they need. And so being able to speak to that was specific to my experience as a social worker, but I do believe that everyone has an experience that would help them be a good elected official. We have these bubbles that we've created, that you have to be something, you have to have so much money, you have to work in some profession. And we just kind of isolate ourselves because of whatever societal standards are out there, rather than thinking, I bring something to the table. And whether or not you're a good public speaker, or whether or not you've ever really dove into issues and figured out maybe a map of how we could resolve those things. Those are all things you can learn. Those are all things that you can practice and be better at. But your perspective as an individual, as someone who's not currently represented, someone who's younger, a woman, a person of color, whatever it might be, bringing that new perspective is what needs to happen. So my particular experience was things aren't okay. And that was enough of a motivator. And when I mentioned to a mentor, like, I want to do this, I want to work in this building, they were like, okay, well, let's find you a job. And I'm like, no, you don't understand. Like, I want to vote here. I want to be someone who's making the decisions. And it was kind of like, what are you talking about? Like, I don't think, what? No, you have no political experience and you're young and so forth. And it was like, that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter anymore. Like, things are so far off the rails that we need new people in, we need new perspectives. And so anyone who's listening, your experience is enough, and your experience will help bring a new perspective and something that's missing currently into office, whatever that might be.
Yeah, I think that's so important, bringing new perspectives to the table. And lots of our candidates talk about those feelings or those experiences where someone sort of patronizes them about being young, or using the classic, you don't have enough experience, which somehow is code for you're not a 65-year-old white lawyer. So yeah, I think that's absolutely so important. I'm so glad that you brought that up. Jen, political campaigns spend a lot of time on voter contact, and there's usually lots of talk about knocking doors and canvassing voters at their homes. In rural areas, because voters often don't live as close to each other, this may not be the most efficient use of a campaign's time. What are some ways that you connected with voters in your district?
So, as a current precinct committee person in South Wheatland 2, our houses are about an average, football field length apart. So it's walkable, but uncomfortable. A lot of rural districts that you will run in are going to be even further than that. When I was running, we used phone banking a lot. And not your typical, like, I'm Jen McMillin, please vote for me. But we did a lot of questioning. This is my name, this is what I'm running for. What are 3 issues that you are really worried about right now? And we would just talk to them. And, a lot of politicians that have been in the game, or mentors that you'll find, they will tell you that phone time, get in, and it's usually for money, get in, get out, and move to the next one. And these rural voters, you can't do that to them. You really want to take the time to listen to them, because a lot of those people that I called and talked to, they had never talked to a politician before, ever. And they were really surprised that I called. The other thing that I would encourage you is, I know it sucks to get out and walk some of those districts, but those small towns, if you can find populations that are grouped together, go and knock on doors. It may be a slog, and you might not get a lot of people to answer the door, but they will remember seeing you. And, Sally down the street will tell Bobby that, there was a strange lady and she had this bag and a button, and that will start to spread. And the more that they see you in those communities, the more authentic you come across, the more genuine. A lot of our rural voters, they're used to seeing the smoke and flash of a politician come through and announce something or shake hands and want to vote. They're really surprised when you ask them, what could I do for you if elected that would make a real difference? So phone calling, and then, just make a day of it. I sent my mom door knocking with me one time. That works real well too.
That's great. And I like how you echoed back to Chloe's point about listening and how important that is, and that those authentic personal conversations really do have a big impact, whether it's on the phone or at the doors or however you can have them, at the feed store. I mean, wherever you can have them. Chloe, can you tell us a little bit about how you connected with voters in your district that maybe weren't what we call traditional Democratic supporters?
Yeah. So a lot of everything that I've done with our campaigns in Maine has been co-done with my campaign manager, Canyon Woodward. And I'll drop in the chat, but we just wrote a book about everything and it's very exciting and coming out in May, so yay. But Canyon is a political genius and also grew up in a very rural red community. And he created a universe for me that was so drastically different than what the state party gave us. And if it wasn't for that, we would have lost. I mean, I tried using the universe that the state party gave me, and I knew instantly that it wasn't going to work because it was all Democrats and it was too positive. But I think we did do a lot of door knocking, tons and tons and tons and tons of doors, and it takes forever, and you need way more volunteers, and it's miserable sometimes, but it's also like refreshing because folks in rural communities usually don't have someone come and knock on their door and, like Jen said, just say, hey, what's on your mind and how can I help bring that into policy? So people usually respond really well to it, unless they have one of those signs that has a gun on it that says, you're gonna meet the Lord, but trespassing will get you there faster. That's always my favorite one.
That's great. And I'm really excited about the book. I didn't know about the book. But yeah, I think that, again, that point of, especially in rural communities, sometimes people never had someone knock on their door before. So it can be really impactful if it's possible, if it's a functional place to do that. Jen, many run for something candidates tell us that running for office is a lonely endeavor, both in rural and suburban and urban areas. And your experience with running in a conservative area made it all the lonelier. Can you tell us about your experience and how democratic infrastructure can be improved by future candidates, that the folks that are on tonight's call? And how is your considering running in 2022 different from your 2020 campaign?
Oh, there's a lot of questions there. So the loneliness part, that one's hard, mainly because there's no way to really combat it. Running like I did, I was a real long shot candidate. So my state party, was real hesitant to give me any resources, any staff. They were just like, you're going to do great. Go right ahead. So the key thing for me was to find a couple of people that I really trusted to bounce ideas off of, that knew the party at the state level and the local level, but knew what my end goals were. For me, in the state of Illinois, I'm sure somebody on the call has heard of Mike Madigan. He was our, evil devil of a Democratic speaker here in the state of Illinois. And we ended up, we picked a couple of fights with the party over things like that. It's gotten a lot better. We have a really great new speaker, Chris Welch, as well as a new state party chair. Not that I, hated Mr. Madigan. He was what we needed at the time, I think. But knowing when to push on things with the party. The voter universe was one of those things that, they tried to tell me you're only going to win with Democratic voters. I went and I knocked on every door that I thought I could convince. And that included some Republican doors. That included, by accident, a white supremacist one time. That was a lot of fun. You got to make the most out of it. Making those connections and making sure that you've got a really good contact that you can bounce ideas off of. The loneliness part, that's one thing that we've talked about at our state level. What can we do for rural candidates? For us down here, it's messaging. A lot of our county parties, we're just, volunteers. I'm a mom of 3 with a full-time job. And, I don't have time to come up with those messages. So getting our state party leaders, our local leaders to understand, not only do we need that message, but we need it in a language that rural voters can understand. Nobody's going to care about repaving I-80 in Chicago down here. They do care about, water mains in Argenta, though, and that's something that we can do. So that's one area that, we really need our state party here in Illinois to turn it up. They've gotten better over the last 2 years, but we really need that message and that help, that infrastructure.
Well, I'm really glad to hear that things are getting better. But yeah, I mean, I think that point of finding partners that are trusted partners, and, that's something that Run for Something that we try to do in our coaching for folks, but, we're not there with you. It really helps to have people there on the ground that know the district that can also be that support. And, it is always an ongoing battle to get the powers that be that are often in more of the urban or suburban areas to really incorporate messaging that fits for rural communities and to take that seriously. So I'm so glad you made those points. Audrey, let's do a quick one with you. How are state-based groups like Blue Horizon Texas, and would love to hear more about what you're doing with them, or national groups like Run for Something, helpful to rural candidates? What can they provide that help bridge some of these gaps for rural candidates?
I am so happy to be able to talk about this and to also address it right after Jen's question, because thinking about that experience, it is so lonely. It is so lonely to be the only Democrat on the entire ticket in an area. And Blue Horizons is a group that I sit on the board for here in Texas that recently started. Our founders, Stephanie Phillips and Claire Barnett, are former candidates in rural areas themselves who felt this loneliness, who felt this need, and decided we need to do something about it because the state party isn't addressing this. I got a lot of pats on the head. You're a great candidate. This is going to be awesome. But there was even no additional support offered. There weren't talking points. There weren't kind of those lead-ins. So this organization, Blue Horizons Texas, is doing that. It's helping candidates come together, create a community coalition, making a space where you can go and say, like, I have no idea what to do here, and have former candidates and volunteers give you that feedback and idea. One of the most foundational pieces of my run was that I convinced a couple other women to run with me. And so I was running for state senate and had 2 women running for state house in my district with me after a couple of conversations. And it was crucial. It was, along with Run for Something support and the support from other candidates, that's how I was able to kind of sanely get through it, because you really do need somebody to connect with, and especially a first-time candidate not being able to have an outlet. So finding other candidates who are available to you is critical. If you're going to run, I would say reach out to every other candidate that's going to be on the ballot with you, whether you cross just, one county line, one city line, whatever it might be. If there's anybody else who you can join forces with, having that support and that camaraderie and companionship throughout is pretty critical. And so Blue Horizons is really helping out with that. And they're doing a lot of the work similar to Run for Something here in Texas, really helping some of those down ballot candidates. So we're working over the same pool of folks, really making sure that we do have a slate of candidates running and that they feel supported when there's not a whole lot of other resources available. So I think that Ben dropped the link for Blue Horizons Texas already in the chat box, but if you're in Texas or you just want some ideas, it's a great space to go find more information about running as well.
Those are great suggestions for support. And I am so glad to hear about the work that Blue Horizon is doing. I mean, I think that we love working with partners on the ground that are doing that kind of support work, because there's such a gap sometimes, especially for candidates that are outside of like the top targets for the caucus, which, as we all know, is pretty limited and often excludes rural areas. So that's wonderful. Okay, I think in a minute here, we're going to open up the floor to questions. I see that some people have already put questions in the Q&A box, but go ahead and any questions you have, put them in the Q&A box. Before we start in on those questions, we're going to launch a poll. If you're interested in talking more about your plans to run for office or brainstorming next steps, in this poll, opt into a call with a Run for Something volunteer. So if you're running for office in 2020 and apply for endorsement, this volunteer call will sort of serve as an endorsement interview. If you are still just thinking about running and don't know when you're going to run, the volunteer will ask you questions that will help you figure out what to do next and how to sort of frame your thinking about running for office. If you opt in to speak with a volunteer, you will receive an email from them in the next few weeks to find a time time that works for both you and them to talk for about 30 minutes about your campaign plans. And while we're waiting for everyone to answer the poll, you can also drop any questions you have into our Q&A box. Okay, let's see there. You should see the poll now. If you can't see the poll, would you put it in the chat and make sure we don't have any technical problems? But I see people responding, so yay, I think you can see it. So again, if you want to talk to a volunteer about your next steps or about the endorsement process, opt in to the conversation. And if you're not interested in that right now or don't feel ready for that, that's fine too. But if everybody could give us a response, that'll make it easy for us to know how to respond to you after this call. So just take a second now and put your answer into the poll, and we'll leave it up for another 30 seconds or so. And why don't we get into some questions while I'm giving you a second to answer this poll. So let me go ahead and look at the questions that have come in. I should have mentioned this before, but I'm going to give your first name and then read out the question so folks can answer it. If you would rather me not use the first name, go ahead and put that in the Q&A box, and hopefully I'll see it in time and won't use your first name. And I'm going to do my darndest to pronounce names correctly, but please, feel free to put in the Q&A if I've made a mistake. So let's start with Victoria. Victoria's question is, do you have to have a college degree in order to run for office and be taken seriously as a young progressive in a rural town? Who would like to answer this? Feel free to just unmute yourself and hop in. Well,
I've worked around education my entire career. And I have had the joy of working with some really, really smart people that didn't go to college. And also, a lot of union members that may have done an apprenticeship and some college courses instead of going for a 4-year degree. I think it's more about, your readiness and not your degree. There are a lot of life experiences that you can bring without that college degree that we just don't know of. And a lot of times we're relying on people like me to bring the message, when really it would be so much more impactful if it came from the person that experienced it. So I do think there are some skills that, going to college may have helped with, especially with time management and, juggling all of the different technology requirements, especially if you're a small campaign. But those are things you can easily pick up. I don't think you need to be a college graduate.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. We have lots of candidates that come from all kinds of different backgrounds. And really, it's about your connections to the community and knowing the issues and really being prepared to represent those perspectives that we talked about earlier in the conversation. Let's go to the next question. Marcelo is asking how to prepare for a debate if you're an introvert. Chloe, you want to try that one?
Sure. I loved all my debates because I was always the only woman there and the only young person there. And I'm very much an introvert. So I think everyone's going to have their own process, and every process is valid. What I did was create an extremely long document of facts, and then I memorized all the facts, and then that's kind of how I went about it. But I think I also thought about ways to create a different type of energy in these settings than the energy that one might be expecting from a debate. So like my second time I ran, everything was in COVID. So it was televised and it was like a little bit weird, but I kind of was able to rise above what I knew my opponent would talk about. But when I first ran, all these men just sat in their chairs, like with their arms crossed like this the entire time. There's like five men, and I stood up and then, and like talked and used my hands and had some emotion to my voice, and just small things like that maybe take a lot of energy from you as an introvert. They often have a really big impact on people, and because they're sitting there bored as heck because everyone wants good education, everyone wants good jobs, and it's like you can't tell the difference. And so you just gotta like find that thing you can bring.
That's great advice. That's amazing advice. And I bet you absolutely did have a huge impact by doing something different. Charles is asking, and why don't we try you with this one, Audrey? Charles is asking that that they will soon graduate from graduate school with a degree in school counseling, and they hope to work in the public school system back home while possibly running for a local office in 2023 or later. Do you have any advice on how to bring up my intent to run with my principal if and when I decide to? And do you have any advice on how to be proactive about maintaining trust and engagement with my students, and in particular, their more partisan parents?
Really, really great question. And I'm thinking about one experience I had with a teacher who said, I want to bring you into my civics class and I want my students to ask you questions and be engaged. And one principal at the school had told my friend, the teacher, yes, you can do this. And then the superintendent found out that I was a candidate, not a currently elected official, and they shot me down. And it was mostly because I was a Democratic candidate talking versus, and so there is another realm of politics that comes along with, as I'm sure you're already aware, Charles, with schools and everything else that goes there, especially in rural areas where we are seeing, this big push to bring, feels like, more politics into schools and change over school boards and bring all in one mind and one voice, it seems like. So all that to say, don't get discouraged. There's a lot there, but definitely I think opening that line of intent and having those conversations now so that you can kind of gauge what their expectations might be, what kind of hurdles or barriers they may already be contemplating or may put in place as you're making that run. So I do think you're on the right track. You're already thinking about like being proactive and having those conversations. And I would definitely support and agree that that's the way that you need to go. I see that Jen's already got a hand up too, so I might pass it over to, to you, Jen, so that we tag team this one.
Perfect. Perfect. Go for it, Jen.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt, but there's something that I do want to remind everyone. I actually ended up resigning from my position 1 year because I could not run as a partisan person in my job. It was frowned on. And I would just encourage everyone to make sure, if that or something similar happens to you, make sure you know your legal rights. There are freedom of speech laws in this country for a reason. And, if you feel very passionately about something, you shouldn't have to give up your job just to make that happen. Unfortunately, sometimes that does happen, or you feel that you need to, but stand up for yourself and make sure, is what they're doing legal? Is there a way that I could make this more equitable? We got around that a couple of times as when I was running. We would invite the Republican along as well, or I would invite a former state rep who is a Democrat to present, and I would just tag along. So, look for inventive ways to kind of bridge that gap and make sure you're protecting yourself and your best interest as well.
That's super helpful. That's super helpful. Now let's do a question from Tashina. There's actually two questions in this, and I'm just going to open up to anyone who wants to answer. Tashina says that they would love to run, but they're terrified of the extreme racists. They're indigenous and a big supporter of changing, like the racist Indian mascot locally, but that has led to a lot of harassment of themselves and their children. A few school committee members resigned and many teachers quit due to the harassment of a small group of people. Any advice on how to combat that? And then the second question, which I think is also notable, is it worth running even if you think you will lose? So there's two pieces there. So for the first part about how to deal with extreme racists or sexists or people that really are harassing and being ugly, anybody want to field that one?
It's a tough one and it's not fun. My personal experience was around, being a young woman, and a lot of the harassment I was expecting to happen in person very rarely happened in person. So it was online, it was through my social campaigns, it was through various other ways that people could reach out to our campaign. And so in that way, it was, a way that I never silenced any comments or never deleted any comments on our page. It was always there for public view. And so folks could see that we're not trying to censor anyone, but it was a way that we could, disconnect from it, where it was, I really just didn't even look at those comments. I had a team member who was kind of managing social, and so that I could kind of disconnect in that way. And I was pleasantly surprised that it didn't come up, as I mentioned, that much in person. But there was one of the very first times I spoke publicly, got quite a bit of harassment right after. And it was someone who came up to me directly after. That was a lesson learned, that like my safety is the most important piece of this. And at the end of it, whether win or lose, I'm still going to have to keep moving on and keep doing, and I want to keep doing. So there were just kind of barriers that we kind of put up in place. So like after speaking, I immediately had a staff person or a volunteer with me. Like I would never just let myself be in that space again alone, and just kind of creating those safe spaces with each of the events that we did. But that's kind of how we handled it. It was just like, I'm going to make a barrier. I'm going to make a safe zone for myself. Oh, it looks like you're muted, Andrea.
Thank you, Audrey. Yeah, this is something that's coming up more and more in the last year or two. And I wish that we could offer like, oh, do this and it solves all the problems. But a lot of it is creating those safe places for yourself and making sure you're protecting yourself and carving out space for yourself and trying to keep some distance to it. Would anybody like to, Jen, did you have something you wanted to add?
Well, I was going to address the second part of that, whether or not it's, so like I said earlier, I went into a race. I knew I was going to lose the state rep race. I knew in every fiber of my being that I was not going to win that race. However, it was a lot of fun, and it gave me the freedom to do what I really thought was the best thing possible, because I knew I was going to lose. So we could try a new universe. We could do weird social media advertising. We could have my 5-year-old as my campaign manager. And some of those things really worked. Some of them didn't. But it gave me that freedom. And the one thing that really helped in my community is to show people you can run. Like, it doesn't matter who you are, you can run. Just to show them that, I worked full-time job because I knew I was going to lose. I can't give up my job, but you can run a full-time job, you can run a family and still make an impact and get voters to turn out and change the conversation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would 100% agree with all of that. So I remember a conversation that I had with my husband, and he was like, so what are the odds? And I was like, I think I've got a 3% chance. And he's like, you're doing this for 3%? And I'm like, yes, I'm doing this for 3%. There has not been a Democrat run for this seat in more than 20 years, and people need to see people do it. And there were so many other things that I knew we were going to be able to accomplish. We were going to be able to help the county parties. We were going to be able to get more young people involved. We were going to get more people registered to vote. So I would actually say, go into it knowing that you're going to lose and pick another goal, because every time you reach a goal in one race, you're getting yourself closer to a win in the next race. And so if you get more people registered, you get more people engaged, you get more people to run, you grab, okay, I did this by myself this time, I'm not doing it again. Now you're on the ballot with me, and you get more people into that process. And so yes, 100%, even if you think you're going to lose, even if you know 100% that you're going to lose and you have a 0% chance, we need more Democrats, more young progressive people running in rural areas.
Those are fabulous answers. This next one, Chloe, let's see if you have thoughts on this. This is from Keegan. How does a progressive Democrat like me even begin to address the concerns in a very rural, very right-wing residents often have, in a way that actually reaches them and convinces them?
That's such a good question, Keegan. And I think it's a question that I learned to answer by talking to those folks. For all my door knocking, I had my volunteers go talk to the Democrats because it was like a lot easier and a lot kinder. And so almost all of I think I've maybe knocked on 200 Democratic doors, and all the rest of the 20,000 has been Republicans and independents. And And it's through those conversations that I learned how to connect with folks who have a Trump sign on their lawn, who are saying wild things that I like can't wrap my mind around. And I think what I've found is that I could almost always find common ground with somebody, even if, 90% of our conversation we disagree, there's usually 10% where we do agree. And I focus on that 10% and just try and talk about that 10% with that person. And on the other 90%, I try not to be too judgmental. People got the right to think what they're going to be. And so I just listen and I don't really react. I'd like to put an asterisk and then footnote. There are some really huge caveats to this, where people are being explicitly racist or violent or sexist, and you don't have to listen to that. You can exit that conversation. I don't participate in those conversations, but or you can argue with them if you want to, but I don't find that ever goes well. So I think for the most part, this act of listening uncovers the answer to your question. And but I think it's like I saw someone in the chat ask what a universe is, and I'm sorry for introducing that jargon without explaining it. It's the group of people that you go and talk to, because when you're canvassing, you don't talk to every single person in your community, because that would take forever. You talk to a strategic group of folks who are the difference between you winning or losing. So the creation of a universe is usually more of a specialized skill. So anyways, having a good universe that enables you to have those conversations with the right folks is really so key to you as a candidate being able to form those relationships.
Awesome. That's hugely helpful. This one I'll open up to whomever wants to answer it. This is a question from Ian. What are tangible first start moves that you can do to figure out what you'd best be suited to run for? And how can you help once you decide and you want to commit to public service? How do you sort of get started? So maybe thoughts about how you would do it now or how you did it when you ran. Who would like to jump in on this one?
Give it to you, Jen.
Okay, I'm gonna take a stab at this one. So don't do it the way that I did it. Don't prove that you're smarter than your congressman. That's terrible decision. Looking back, I would take a look at what you like to do. If you really like records management and knowing your community, maybe county clerk is a really good position for you. If all you like is federal legislation and that's all you know, please don't run for state rep. So know what your interests are, what you really care about. And then if you're not familiar with your local party precinct committee people, go hang out with them. There's got to be one older person that has met every candidate known to man in the last 50 years and just have a really good conversation. What does my community need? What are some positions that might come open in the next 5 years? And just listen a lot. I know we keep saying listen, but it's not going to make you happy to run for an office that is not a good fit. If you absolutely hate county politics, don't run for county board. Even if it is that first step that you see an opening, make sure you really care about what you're running for.
Did you want to add to that, Audrey?
So the only other thing that I would add to that is that there were quite a few people who would come to me at events or whatever and tell me, you need to do this when you're elected. And it's like, well, that's not actually anything that I could control. So just like getting familiar with what's on the ballot. So exactly like Jen said, figuring out where you feel like this is what I want to impact, and figuring out which office could actually impact what's most dear to your heart. Because if you're passionate about the issue, you're going to be able to come off way more authentic and get more buy-in from people when you're out speaking, rather than having to teach yourself just because it's something that's on the ballot that's like, hey, this is a seat that's coming up for it. But yeah, I would definitely say take what you're passionate about, what you're interested in, and then find out what could impact that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that following your passion absolutely makes sense. And Jen's comments absolutely are 100% true. Okay, let's look at Well, this is an interesting question from Jeffrey that I think especially fits Audrey and somewhat Jen, but probably Chloe too. So I'll sort of leave it open to you about who wants to answer it. He's asking, how do you convince people to run for office? So how do you do recruitment in rural areas, not just decide yourself whether to run?
That's a great question. And it was one of my goals. So I knew that if I wasn't going to win, I was going to get other people to run and we were going to lose together. And so what I did is exactly what I just kind of described with thinking about what you might want to run for was, as I was talking to people, if they came to me with, hey, I really think that this matters and you should be paying attention to it and you should bring it into your campaign, then I would say, why don't you think about that? And if you're, if you've got this passion for it, then let's think about what positions could actually impact that and kind of doing that education around it. And a lot of people will be like, no, that's not interesting to me. But if they're coming to a county party meeting, they're showing up at other candidates' events, there's some interest there. And so it's just kind of giving them the push to say like, literally, no, it is you because there is no one else on the ballot that is running for this race or whatever it might be, or kind of getting yourself familiar with who is on the ballot and who is currently elected and being like, okay, so this person hasn't had an opponent or this person's been in the same seat for however long, and kind of giving them some of those facts about what the different offices could be and just asking them to run. I think a lot of times we forget that people want to be asked both to be a volunteer and to get into these races. And so finding out what they're passionate about, giving them some ideas of what they could run for, and then asking them to run.
And asking them again and again and again, because especially with women, it'll take us 5 times. If you ask us 5 times, we might think about it. Men, I don't think require as many, but, ask every time you go.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, let's look at a question from Kara, and Chloe, maybe you'll have some thoughts on this. Kara asked a couple questions. I think the ones I'm going to surface are, what was your most bang for your buck method of reaching voters? You'd mentioned canvassing before, but that may not have been the one that felt like the most bang for your buck. And how important was social media for your campaign?
Yeah, I think that's most bang for buck. I'd say bang for buck was probably my free labor canvassing. But I think I don't know. The first thing that came to mind was we did like a lot of postcard writing, especially during COVID, and we would have people write postcards to folks within a certain mileage of their zip code, just using the voter database. We'd create them a nice little universe, and everyone would write 50 postcards or whatever, be like, hey, I live down the road from you, vote for Chloe. And it was so successful. But we had to print the postcards. But I think that was something that we did. We also in COVID did a lot of lit dropping. So we would have people, because our volunteers didn't feel comfortable knocking, and so we would just have them drive to a door and leave a pamphlet there, and they would so often find folks outside, and so they could have a nice, safe outdoor conversation. And and that was that. And then I forgot the second half of that question.
Second half was how you use social media, and was that important for your campaign?
Oh, yes. Social media, I feel like that's tricky in rural communities because most rural communities don't have awesome broadband, and rural communities, at least my rural community, is a lot more older folks. So it's not really the sweet spot. We definitely did a little bit of paid media, but it was more to keep, our broader young network involved in the work rather than to do vote work. Where I live, we're really lucky that we have a weekly paper that's actually read. And so we spend most of our money on print advertising and the little radio stations. So, but it totally depends on your community. I mean, you're gonna know what works best for your folks.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let's do another question because we're running short on time. So let's do one final, maybe 2 more questions. Joshua is saying that, and I don't think this really applies, maybe your office, Jen, but I'm running for in a nonpartisan election in a rural area. How do you deal with voters questioning your political stances without seeming like a blatant partisan? My goal is to focus more on policy related to the issues versus sort of the general positions that might be less popular in a rural or less affluent area.
Ooh, this one's hard.
Okay, good.
And I will say that when I was doing my candidate petitions, I did not lead off with what party I was from, just for that reason. Just because I wanted them to be able to hear what I was doing and what I was focused on, rather than that party affiliation. I think really talking to them, and sometimes you can just avoid the question altogether. I successfully avoided, my party question for 20 minutes one time door knocking, and I convinced an NRA member to sign my petition until he noticed that I was a Democrat. So I think, making yourself open, being really authentic, and just having the conversation. They may not agree with you all the way, but showing them what you really believe, what you really care about, I think will make a big difference. So.
That's great. That's great. No, I think that's a solid answer. It can be hard to sort of transcend those sort of divisions. But again, I think it goes back to things that all three of you have said about listening and making those real connections that will transcend some of those divisions. So we've had so many questions, and I'm sorry I haven't been able to get to them all, but we're going to do one last one from Victoria, which is it a good idea to start a run for a school board or a local committee in a town? Is there a limit to what's realistic to try for the first time when running? Any one of you that want to answer that, just jump right in.
That was one of the big pitfalls that I experienced right at the beginning, or kind of the pushbacks, was you can't run for state senate. You have to be a state rep before you can be a state senator. And like, where did that rule come from? Like, no, if I run as a state senator, I'm going to cover 16 counties. I'm going to meet all of these people who are going to help me. And when I do run for state rep, then I've got a bigger breadth of name recognition already built to help me build, a campaign for a smaller seat. So I don't think any particular science. I think there's a lot of misconception that you should start small and work your way up. But if I started at 33 whenever the first race, and then by the time I get through all of these different positions and actually give them any of my energy, I'm going to be 60 years old before I get to run for the state senate. And so, no, I don't think so. I think run for whatever your heart is telling you to run for.
Awesome. Anyone else have any thoughts about that, or any final comments you'd like to make before we wrap things up?
I just wanted to echo what Audrey just said. I think it's something that you just got to do it, and you can think about it and plan it forever, but the only real way is to do it. And I think there's a lot of factors that go into making it work, and how you get paid to do the work. But I think if you get yourself a good team and you got your support, you just go do it, and you can do so much with so little.
Yeah. And one thing, just looking down the list, I know we've got a lot of women on the call, and I feel obligated to say this as, the lady holding the baby. If you are a mom or a dad and you're running for office, it's okay to feel guilty. But realize that your kids see what you're doing, that you are engaged, and that you care about something so deeply. That's a real experience for them too. You may miss some things that you really regret, but it's so much more worth it when your kids see you out there making a difference. And it makes you all warm and fuzzy when your kids go to their rural school and campaign for Joe Biden in their classroom. So, it's okay to feel guilty. You're going to feel guilty either way if you run or not. But just know that your kids see the good and the bad, and the good usually outweighs the bad.
I love it. I love all of the wonderful things that you've shared with us tonight for the three of you. And I'm going to wrap this up in just a second, but I also have noticed that there's been some great conversations in the chat. And I just wanted to let everyone know that you can save the chat by clicking on those three little dots in your chat box. It'll let you save it so that you can go back and refer to some of that information. And again, I'm sorry we didn't get to everybody else's questions, but there's a lot of resources on our website, and we do weekly calls with prospective candidates that you'll get some more information about in an email that can help answer these questions. But before we go, I do want to thank all of our panelists this evening for sharing your wonderful wisdom and fabulous experiences with us tonight. We also want to thank to everyone who participated and asked questions. That makes all the difference. Everyone on this call, as I mentioned, will be getting an email from us tomorrow morning with resources from Run for Something to use as you prepare to run for office. And if you opted to speak with a volunteer, look for that email from them in the next few weeks. It usually takes a couple weeks, but that email should be coming to find a time to schedule a call to talk about your plans. We need you to run. We need you to be involved in the process. So I so hope that you got as inspired tonight as I did and are ready to go out and conquer the world. And we are here to support you. Thank you very much and have a good night.